Hello and welcome to Shite Talk, an Irish history podcast. This is a very special episode that we got to record from inside a historic building in Inchicore. We did this episode on the 1913 Lockout, and we got to do it inside of one of the strike leaders' houses, and a building that was owned by James Larkin and the headquarters of the Irish Citizens Army and the Irish Transport and General Workers Union headquarters for this area. And we got to go in there thanks to the DA development group who've been doing up the building. We got set up in there with a small group of mostly people over on our Patreon and then a couple of local historians that came in. And to top it all off, we had a great guest, Donal Fallon of the Three Castles Burning podcast with us. There is a slight issue with the audio. It's a bit echoey in times because we were doing it inside a big hall and we didn't capture the audience's interactions great, but I've tried to amplify them a bit, so it might sound a bit choppy whenever the audience is talking, but hopefully you'll be able to hear what they're saying because there's some great input from some of the attendees. But yeah, this is an episode that I've been looking forward to doing for a while. It's now, by chance, coming out ahead of the anniversary of the 1916 Rising, which will be next Sunday. The building's tied to the Rising that it housed Michael Mallin, who ended up executed over his role in the Rising, who was also associated with Con Colbert, who was executed as well, both in Kilmainham, only a few minutes away from the hall. So maybe in the next week of there being 100 podcasts about the 1916 Rising, maybe this is a different angle. I'd say Mallin and Colbert are certainly two of the lesser written members of the people who were executed during 1916. So yeah, it is a bit about their life. But if you enjoyed hearing this episode, you can come along and see myself, Jason, and Donal Fallon all live in the Wild Duck in Temple Bar on the 19th of May. And that'll also be our third birthday party show and the 100th episode show, so why wouldn't you? We just found out today that we're halfway sold, so if you want to go, you better hurry up and get your ticket. Also, if you want to go to the Carlow gig, that'll be on this Friday, which will be today if you're listening to it today that comes out. We're doing a show in Scraggs Alley about the Carlow war man Miles Keogh. We're doing that with Shano Basso Goal. That'll also be class crack. And if you're in Dublin for the weekend, a friend of ours, Bly in the Burka, is doing a live podcast in Shinay with the Hysteria crowd, all about women in Irish history. And that's going to be the first in our monthly panel show series in there in Hysteria called Blah Blah Blah. She had a run of that in the 2019 Dublin Fringe, which went very well. And this is the first iteration of the show back. I think for this episode she's got Melanie Lynch, the founder of the Her Story site, Dr. Mary McAuliffe, and Dr. Lorraine Grimes. Like 2 doctors in one panel. I don't even think any doctors listen to the show. So we'll link that in our page. You can follow Blow for details on that, or follow Hysteria for other details on that show as well. Come see us live if you're in the live podcasting mood. And if you don't want to do any of that, well then, grand. Here's an episode about the 1913 Lockout, recorded live from inside Michael Mallin's house.
Gather around now, you're in for a story. Old tales of lore, all in search of a glory. The history and mystery of lads, lasses and all. Discoveries and voyages, the rise and the fall. Follow me now as we go back in time. We trace the steps of Irish lineage to find. Joseph from Carlow and Gavin the Dog guide you through the ways of Shite.
Dipping it out. What are you reading?
It is from, I was minus 14 years of age when it was published.
Okay. Yeah.
I was still 14 years on the horizon.
Oh, yeah. That's a very egotistical way to measure historical events. 14 years BD. I do the same thing.
Donal, would you like a beer? And
Yes, I'd love a beer.
Would you like a... Will you take that one?
Larkin, the militant teetotaler, would be horrified.
Yes, yeah. Perfect, yeah. So before we start, thanks a million to Lauren for setting this up and doing so much class work on this place. It looks great. So yeah, we're going to talk about the 1913 Dublin Lockout. I don't know if anyone else did the leave insert around.
I bet almost everyone here did the leave insert.
You'd be surprised. There's no bar of entry for this. But I did the leave insert around 2008, 2009. I should probably know the exact year for that. But as part of the history course for that was the 1913 Lockout, which I completely forgot about until I started reading this stuff again. So we're going to be talking about not only the Dublin Lockout, but also a lot of things that I am not that I'm qualified to talk about history, but there's also going to be stuff about union movements, labour rights, socialism. So you two will have to do a bit of heavy lifting for some of
I'm going
this.
to pass that book straight on. That's
Yeah.
not, yeah.
Anytime you see Jason looking confused, just pray that Donal will step in and answer something. So as a setup, the main action is happening around 1913, but the Ireland of 1913, 60% agrarian at the time. Most of the stuff was focused on farming. Belfast was the only real industrial city. It had textile and shipbuilding, but they had their own issues with sectarianism. Dublin, comparatively, I'm not really sure how it fared so much worse than Belfast, but full of slums. Some of the worst slums in Europe, apparently. There's a report from 1912 showing that TB deaths were 50% higher in Ireland than England or Scotland. About a third of the city was living in poverty. There was 100,000 people living in crowded tenements. Of the 25,000 families living there, 80% of them would live in one room in the tenements, and about 1,500 families lived in cellars, which it's not great today, but living in a cellar doesn't seem so bad.
Is it a full cellar on my own, or do I have to share it?
You got to share with your whole family of 12.
Oh, okay, not just like a student.
Well, you put it on daft.e for $2.5 a month.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like I've lived in worse places than this during my college days.
But so even for the time, it was pretty bad. Dublin was, to paraphrase, a shithole for the working class. It was pretty good if you're middle class or upper, but not so good otherwise. And in those years, during the struggling for labour, Home Rule was the only thing anyone wanted to talk about here. So the Home Rule bill was in its third iteration, and that's all that the government at any time for. John Redmond, who was leader of the Home Rule Party, said Labour must wait, which I did read as a damning comment, but he's the leader of the Home Rule Party. That was kind of the only thing he was meant to talk about. I was down in Kilkenny about a month ago, and I got a Home Rule badge from the Home Rule Club there, which I was very happily wearing for about a month until I went up to Belfast. Where do you side in Home Rule? Let's figure it out now. Yay or nay?
Home rule?
Yeah, should we do it?
I hear the horse has bolted.
Listen, the time is nigh. So the politicians only wanted to talk about Home Rule. It was when was the last time there had been a parliament in Ireland before that? The 17...
It had abolished
like
itself
1801?
in a moment of unprecedented corruption. In 1800, we lost it in 1801. So we'd gone more than a century without a parliament in Dublin.
So the aim was to try and bring a parliament back. So we'd still be under British rule, but there'd be a centre of government here in Dublin again. And people hated that or loved it. And there was no middle ground for whatever reason. But it was all anyone, because the first one was the 80s, the 1880s, and then there was another one in the 1890s. So they were teeing up for the third one. And it kind of set the background for everything that was happening in the country at the time. So no one gave a shit about Labour until a man called James Larkin came in. So he was a docker and a union organiser from Liverpool. He was born to Irish parents over there. He was sent to Belfast by the National Union of Dock Labourers, the Nuddle, in 1907 when he was about 33. Work conditions in Belfast were better than Dublin, but the main issue there was sectarianism, exclusion from the workforce for Catholics. So Larkin was sent over there, and he came up. I don't know if he came up with it, but it was said that this is where he started using the sympathetic strike, where other unions, even if they weren't directly affected, would also go on strike to support the ship workers in that case. So I don't think that strike, I read that it went moderately well. I think it just sort of ended, but it earned Larkin a lot of clout in the country for his radical methods. He was doing crazy things, but he was getting sort of results. So he was sent down to Dublin, and he came up with another radical idea here to organise the unskilled labourers as well as the skilled labourers. So what would the skilled labourers at the time would have been? Just craftsmen?
Larkin would have had his eye when he arrives into Dublin. It's worth saying when Larkin arrives into Dublin, he has a reputation that kind of precedes him. And James Plunkett, the man who writes Strumpet City, he's a real Larkinite. He gives his life to creating this Larkin in the public mind. But the way he writes about Larkin coming to Dublin is great. He says, when Jim came to Dublin in 1908, he was 32, a handsome young man. I like that he calls 32-year-olds young. I will take that.
I'm
Tall
taking it
and
as
broad-
well. I think there's a lot of people here.
Tall and broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence. His hat was dark and brimmed, and my mother remembers it being rumoured in those early days. He never removed it. because he was the Antichrist and was obliged to hide a third eye that was set in the centre of his forehead. That's quite the reputation to arrive into a city with. And he turns his eye, or his third eye, onto the trams, the Dublin United Tramway Company, and Guinness. One of those things is not easily unionised because, I mean, we're in Dublin 8. A lot of people here probably have Guinness family connections. That was as good an employer as you were going to find this side of heaven. Yeah, a bit more about Guinness in a minute, but if you go back historically, Guinness do some shady stuff in the past, but this was while sure, we'll get into it in a minute, but at the end of this I kept thinking like, Jesus, someone should really write a book or a series about this, and they did, and it was Strumpet City, which I was like, this is I can't believe no one's done it. It's one of the most successful things RT's ever done. But so Peter O'Toole plays Larkin, and if you're trying to put larger than life divisive personality across on screen, you get Peter O'Toole to do it. But what you're saying there is very like Plunkett's description of him coming into town. Watching documentaries about him, like he really was this messianic figure for the workers of Dublin. Like the place was a shithole. They were seeing people profiteering off their work. They were living in terrible conditions, and all of a sudden, a big, tall, handsome man comes down and starts shouting about how things can be better. Like it's like he just strolls into town and he shakes everything up. You can definitely see why some people saw him as the Antichrist. I mean, you have to, these people, the mass of the people. I don't like people, ordinary people. I hate that term. There's no ordinary people. None of us are ordinary. Everyday people. Most of them don't have the right to vote. No. Women don't have the right to vote at all until 1918. Men largely don't have the right to vote. The franchise is so marginal that when someone arrives into a city, a trade union official, and there had been trade unions in Dublin going back a long, long time before this, but they were craft unions. I mean, they represented very small groups of workers. They looked for, we get a pay increase and that's grand. And we stopped the agitation. Now you have someone who's recruiting everyone. He starts recruiting newsboys. The kids with no shoes on their feet are brought into Larkin's union and go on strike in 1911. They're marching through the streets. They're throwing copies of the Evening Herald into the Liffey. Well, which is a great idea. We should all do that on occasion. They knock over an independent van. There's an Indo van turned over by angry newsboys. Like that's the point when people in Dublin, I think, realise this guy Larkin is talking to, and talking with people who had no political representation before. Loads of people are radicals, but you have suffragettes who are talking about the rights of women while they have other women cleaning their houses. You have Irish nationalists that are talking about how we should all learn Irish when people can't read or write. And then you've Larkin talking about the working class lifting itself. And they finally say, this person talks about our class on our level, and we like him. It is funny looking back now how radical all these things seem, but like the big thing for him was that he came down and it was the unskilled labourers he's attaching. So I think people have maybe gotten around to the idea of like equality for all. But he's like, well, what about these part of the all? Is like, not that all. The equality for the all that's like me. But so these are radical ideas, even too radical for the Dockers Union that had sent them over initially. So they suspend him in 1909. He pulls the old, no, I quit, and leaves and forms the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Great name. A great name. Because like we all know what a transport worker is. Sure. A transport worker is a bus driver or it's a tram driver. General worker is everybody. But I would argue it also includes tram workers. It could have just been the General Workers Union. Because you say it's a great name, I had to write down ITGWU a load of times in this script, and I fucked it up about half of them. So if I say the IGTWU at some point, just know that it should have just been the GWU. Why limit it to Irish or transport? I think you should call it the O. There's a slogan he loved to use all the time: one big union, OBU. Would have been just a much better. The badges would have been cheaper to make. Everything would have been better. OBU. The rioter strikes could have ran like an O-behave thing. It was the political cartoons write themselves. My favourite part about this whole story is the political cartoons. It's my favourite part of any story from this time. Ones that are labelled, we'll get into them at the end. But, Larkin, big man on the scene. So thousands of people are showing up to listen to it. It's really interesting to hear the descriptions of people like coming to see it, because back then, obviously, there's no PA systems and mics and such. So he's literally just standing in the middle of a street screaming, and thousands of people are passing the news back to each other. I don't know how he or any of those speakers would have kept their voice, even. How the people would have kept the sentiment of what they were saying. Oh, absolutely. It's like the biggest game of telephone ever. I think what he's on about is... What's weird about it is Larkin lives into the 40s. Yet there's no audio of
Well,
Larkin
spoilers.
that we know of. Yeah, yes, well, he's still alive. No, there's no audio of Larkin, which is kind of mad when you think about how long he was around for. So Edward Carson, who apparently never lost his Dublin accent, but there's several Dublin accents. We can probably imagine what Carson sounded like. It didn't sound like. We don't have audio of Carson or Larkin. So I think when we picture Larkin speaking in our heads, we kind of hear this very Scouse, this modern kind of Scouse accent. But that is a very modern accent. It's that or Peter O'Toole that you hear in your head. But the fact that we don't have audio of Larkin is very strange, because he was, right up until his dying day, he was a public figure. He would have been on the radio. It's strange that those tapes are lost. You really have to imagine Larkin as a speaker. But people like Plunkett, the way they describe him, they just talk about him. Like Markovich says, he's like a primeval force more than a man, which is amazing. And even the policemen who have to go and stand at the back of the room, even they're right, this guy's a really good speaker. His intelligence file is full of these little lines, and God, Larkin can really rouse people. They're frightened of Larkin because he's so good at.
Well, that's why they rally so hard against him, because of how successful he is. But funny when you started saying that, I was thinking exactly of Edward Carson. We just did an episode in Belfast about Carson, and there's no audio surviving of him, but
brave to bring your Irish comedy history podcast to Belfast to talk about Edward Carson.
We really eased into the first 10 minutes. We're like, let's see who Carson was a interesting figure. What do you want to tell him? We met someone in a pub the day afterwards.
Yeah, I don't want to use his name because we've forgotten it by now. But we met. It's that typical thing in Belfast. People are fairly wary until you like which side of it you're on, and then as soon as you like, they give you like an inkling. They're like, "Oh yeah, grand," because this guy was like, "Oh yeah, I pissed on his grave when I was 13," and he's like, "Oh, I'm not proud of it." And we're like, "Oh no, we're on the. Oh, I'm so proud of it." To this day, it's his number one pub story. Like, he only met us for about 20 seconds.
That was within. You didn't even know we were down to do a podcast. It was just, that was his opening line.
Michael here has written about 1798. Will enjoy this one. I remember seeing a picture of a gang of loyalists from Belfast who'd come down to Dublin on the piss for a Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland soccer match, and they photographed themselves outside a pub in Dublin and said, "Great to see that even in this Fenian shithole, there's a pub named after Lord Edward Carson. And the pub, the Lord Edward, is named after Edward Fitzgerald." But they went home thinking it was named after Edward Carson, and that's fine.
Yeah, that's a good friend of mine. They should know the Weatherspoons on Harcourt Street. They should change it to the Edward Carson. But a good friend of mine grew up in Oma, and he used to be in the Orange Boys Brigade or whatever the junior version of the Orange Order was, and they were all on a trip to Canada, and he brought his orange sash down to Niagara Falls so that he could tell everyone back home he wore his sash down the falls. Which he was very proud of for years until he started learning about the Orange Order and was like, oh shit. But, so the General Workers' Union, the boys, had a rocky start up until about 1911. They start getting some wins under their belt. Their first major victory is, I think, early 1913, the Sligo dock strike. And at that stage, their membership is up to about 10,000 people, which is bad news for the employers of Dublin. So in general, the period between like 1911 and 1914 is known as the Great Unrest in terms of the labour movement in Ireland and in Britain. Not because of the numbers of people that were involved in it, but because of the numbers of people who got the shit kicked out of them. But this is the second character in the story, a man called James Connolly. Another British-born man, an Edinburgh Marxist. He founded the Irish Social Republic Party and started the Workers' Republic newspaper. So by 1911, he was appointed the ITGW's Belfast organiser, and then the following year, he joined Larkin in founding the Irish Labour Party. They founded the party in order to represent the workers' opinions during the Home Rule debate, which was still the only thing anyone was talking about. But in 1912, Jim Larkin and the union opened a hall at number 122 Emmet Road. Hey! That's this place.
I picked that up as
from context.
I was happy I'd heard of James Connolly.
Take that one off. So it was known as the Emmet Hall, which is a uniquely Irish thing of just putting the in front of everything. Everyone was talking about the COVID for the last 2 years. But yeah, it's written as the Emmet Hall, but from the book that you lent me, actually, it was accounts of people referring to it as Larkin's Hall up until even relatively recently, which I thought I was going to stumble onto a whole thing because I live over there, and for ages I thought that maybe the road was named after the hall rather than the other way around, because it seems strange that they would have named a road after, presumably Robert Emmet, because of its proximity to Kilmainham Jail, but to have done that before the War of Independence or anything, when things were renamed. It seems strange that they slipped that one under the radar. But so it was set up here mostly for administration work for the trade union, but also because of its proximity to a certain tram work that was down the road. I don't know if the people are familiar with Inchicore, there's a Spar down the road, and behind that is Spa Road, and there used to be the Spa Road's tram works on that.
What?
Yeah, well,
Who's that one named after?
I don't know. There's a tramway apartments down there. So this was all where all of the buses and trams of Dublin were built and repaired, and they're all owned by a man called William M. Murphy. So this is going to be the villain of the story.
Boo.
Yeah, he's just a pantomime. Although, to be honest, the more I read about him, it's like, he's probably not that bad. But we'll get into it. So he was born in Cork. He was he's off to a bad start. He was a Bantry businessman, a nationalist, a Home Rule MP, and a massive capitalist. So in 1875, he moved the headquarters of his business empire to Dublin. He moved into a manor house of Dartry Hall, which...
It sounded evil.
It did sound
And,
evil, yeah.
Yeah, during the lockout, Larkin, because so many people in Dublin were illiterate, so if you wanted to communicate propaganda, a great way of doing that was visually. And one of the great cartoons that Larkin's newspaper ran was a kind of bird of prey sitting on the gates of Dartry Hall. You know,
The
it just
vulture of
sounds
Dartry Hall.
like somewhere a comic book villain
Yeah.
would live, and a comic book villain did live there.
He did. He looked like Mr. Burns. That's kind of the image that they were going for. So to his credit, so he moves his business empire headquarters to here. By 1913, he's the chairman of the Dublin United Tramway Company that runs all the trams and buses here. So at the time, Dublin's electric tram service was one of the best in Europe and the pride of Dublin, which is very hard to imagine now. His tram network was international. He had stuff in Europe, continental Europe, he had stuff in West Africa, he had stuff in South America. But he still, instead of moving his headquarters to London, like a lot of soup takers would have done at the time, he kept it in Dublin, to his credit. He was, I think, I listened to an episode that you'd done about this at some point there was a big international exhibition in Herbert Park in 1907, and Murphy had a leading role in it, and it was assumed or sort of taken for granted that he was going to get a knighthood because of his work in it, and he said no thanks. He refused, yeah. He made it clear that if they tried to knight him, he'd grab the sword and, who knows what would happen. So he was like an ardent nationalist, and I don't know, he seemed to have some morals in that regard. But
as opposed to Jim Larkin.
Well, I don't want to side with anyone just yet. It's too fresh. It's only 100 years old.
I think the problem with Larkin and William Martin Murphy is that they're both these enormous characters, and they're both divisive characters, even around their own people. Even within the Labour movement, there's an acknowledgement that Larkin is divisive. And Emmet O'Connor, who wrote the great biography of Larkin a few years ago, the subtitle he went with was Big Jim Larkin, Hero or Wrecker? And the answer is actually both of those things. You can be both of those things. And on the other side of the equation, William Martin Murphy is similar. He's not the worst employer in Dublin by any stretch. He's kind of philanthropic enough in his ways. If you've got a job in one of his companies, it's hard enough to get sacked if you're working hard enough. He's putting money into various charities in the city and the like too. But he's a divisive figure even among employers. So Larkin and Murphy, it's these two gigantic personalities. And that's really what the story of the lockout is about. It's not just Labour versus capital. It's Larkinism versus what you might call Murphyism.
Yes. Yeah, as you say, it literally just became about the two of them. And there was no room for nuance. They'll become, by the end of it, the figure of a vulture outside of Dartry Hall, and then the hero of the men. Well, one advantage that Murphy had in that regard was that as his hobby, he owned all of the newspapers in the country. It was just a pastime he had. So he owned Irish Independent, the Evening Herald, and the Irish Catholic newspaper. Certain similarities to a current man. Perhaps. Well, so Murphy's family... Cut the mics for a second. Redacted. Well, Murphy's family held on to Irish Independent News, as it was called, until the 70s when they sold it to a man called Tony, who passed it on to someone else. But that's for another live episode. So as you were saying, he was meant to be a charitable man. He's got the same it's the same thing we know now from all billionaires who will like do charitable stuff.
It's from the goodness of their own heart.
It is. It's not for tax reasons or to distract people 100 years later trying to write podcasts about the shitty things they did. But I meant to check during the Herbert Park exhibition. Am I right in remembering there was like a very racist exhibition in there as well?
It was a mad thing. It was like a World's Fair take up in Herbert Park. So there was basically a human zoo of a kind. They built an Ethiopian village in it, and you could come and see living, breathing Ethiopian children, which is just unbelievable. We think about it now.
Yeah.
And it was all about this kind of dainty and airing idea. Everything in it was made in Ireland except for the Ethiopian children.
Mm-hmm.
It was just this big sense of we can do. It was people like Murphy saying Irish capitalism can carry itself. You know, if you give us our independence, because a lot of the anti-home rule propaganda, there are all these postcards in Belfast, Dublin after home rule, and everything had collapsed, and people had no shoes in their feet, which is actually what Dublin looked like anyway.
Yeah.
But the idea, I think, of the international exhibition was it was a way of that would-be capitalist class of a new Ireland saying, we make things here. Look what we can do. We have the potential to carry ourselves in the world. And hundreds of thousands of people went to see it. It was an absolutely massive event. But when Murphy's offered that knighthood, he turns it down, which was extraordinary. And he's someone who'd been in Parliament. He'd been an anti-Parnell Home Rule MP, but he'd been there. He knew how the British system worked. And he also had interest in railways in other places like South Africa. Like he's a man of the empire in his own way. And Home Rule would have suited someone like that in the sense that Home Rule didn't really mean a break with empire. And I think he would have been quite content to have one hand in and one hand out of the British Empire. That's where the money was. Yeah,
but you certainly see, like, if he was purely motivated by money, he would have done things a lot differently. But so in 1911, it's the Great Unrest. Strike fever is breaking out everywhere. It's unsettling to the Dublin Chamber of Commerce, so they set up an All-Ireland Employers Organisation in September of that year with Murphy as its first vice president. Yeah. So the tramway company was a huge employer, and Big Jim wanted to, if he could crack into that, he'd get an awful lot of members for his union. He was trying from 1911, he didn't have much use, but he had a second attempt in 1913, which went much more successfully, because Murphy, for the first time in his life, was out sick. So this is the paranoia of a man like that, where like he had some mysterious illness, and his wife was probably like, I should fucking take a few days off. What's the worst that could happen?
Larkin.
He comes back and Big Jim's sitting in his chair. But so when he comes back, he's shocked to find, I think he was out for about 3 months, and they never really found out what it was.
Did anyone like throw shade towards the obvious? It was Larkin.
He
definitely did. I would do it.
Maybe he might have slipped something in his cup, I don't know. So when he came back, he was shocked to find so many of his own workers were now in the union. Murphy claimed he wasn't opposed to trade unions in general, but he was opposed to Larkin's type because he saw him as a dangerous revolutionary. Which again, you can get into all this. In a sense, Murphy was not a dangerous revolutionary, but he was a revolutionary because he wanted, I don't know, he's home rule. He wanted an overhaul of the system. He wanted revolution, just not that kind of a revolution.
There's a rank hypocrisy at the heart of this, where Murphy is furious at Larkin's idea of a sympathetic strike. You can't bring all these disparate workers together and tell them to go on strike. That's wrong. But you can bring all these disparate employers together and lock out your work. So basically, what the capitalist class in Dublin do is they take Larkinism and they create a boss's Larkinism. We don't like when you act together, but we're going to act together. It's extraordinary, the hypocrisy of that. It's bosses, it's top-down Larkinism.
Yeah, well, that's the next. By 1913, he was the president of the anti-union union. He'd taken the exact same ideas.
The anti-union union.
Yeah, it's essentially what he'd done. He'd formed the Employees' Federation, and they decided, they unionized and came up with a cohesive response to the ITGW. And on the 19th of July, he warned his employees that if Larkin called a strike, it would be his Waterloo. He said he didn't object to legitimate unions, but he was willing to spend £100,000 or more to put down the terrorism which was being imported into the labour conditions of this city. So he means business. So then this is the bit about Guinness. Guinness is one of the few big companies to not join with this Employees' Federation. So they allowed members to join the union. They had about 400 people in the union, but didn't want them to join sympathetic strikes. But I think 6 of them did, and they let them go, and that was the sort of height of that. But to not let them off the hook entirely, I was also reading that they didn't let Catholics into management positions until the 1960s. But sure, what would they know about managing stuff anyway? They'd be off eating Eucharist or something.
Wait, so only 6 out of 400?
Yeah, went on the sympathetic strike.
But they got let go.
They got let go, yeah.
You got to make an example of someone.
Yeah, the first 6.
Yeah. Like if 400 had have went for it, they're like, we'll be down a lot of workers today. But if 6 people, you're like, you've been warned.
Well, the others probably saw it as a vocation to make pints for the country. But, so that's, in July, he gives them all a stern warning. The next month, in August, the boot's coming down. He fired 340 of his employees for suspected involvement with the ITGW. That's just going to get harder to say as this goes on. So now Larkin has to act. He promised all these workers that they'd be better off if they joined his union, but instead they're all now out of a job. So he organises his walkout. And at 20 to 10 on a Tuesday morning, the 26th of August, all the drivers and conductors of the Dublin tram pinned on their red hand union badges and walk off. They leave their post, they march down to Liberty Hall and officially begin the strike. So 20 to 10 on a random Tuesday might not seem like the most crucial time to bring traffic to a halt, but it was supposed to be Ladies' Day in the horse fair, and he timed it so that he looked at the schedule of all the members that he had and he figured they'd all be in and around O'Connell Street at the time. So if he timed it perfectly, they'd all leave together and it would gridlock the traffic there as well. I'd imagine there was a sentiment of like, if they're close to each other, it's a group thing, because if you're out by yourself and it's 20, if you see everyone else going off and walking off, you will go and do it too. And a lot of them took, so at the time, if you've ever seen trams, there's like I'm not entirely sure what it is. It's a rotary thing to steer the tram or to wind it up, but they took those with them. But Murphy was a cute whore, and he'd been planning for this eventuality for about 2 months. And I think he also had spies in the trade union that had told him that this was the day that was happening. So I think within the hour, all the trams and buses were back moving again, which was a big blow to Larkin and his big move. But it was only round 1. So the trams are all operating in the city again, but they're using like a skeleton staff, or what I'd heard referred to intermittently as scab, blackleg, or knobstick workers. So which one of those will we pick for the rest of this?
Knobstick.
Knobstick, yeah.
I want to know why, but if not...
I tried to find out. No idea.
I thought a scab was the worst thing you could be called in a labour dispute, but I think knobstick might be worse.
Yeah. Knobstick, yeah. Did someone know what knobstick was?
I was asking, was it to do with the handle?
No, I'd read that it was because like a knob sticks out in a control panel. I don't know. The scab has its origins to do with like plague and disease. Blackleg again was fairly vague, but I'd read it's just like all etymology. You read about 6 ones and you pick the one that you like.
Blackleg comes from where the people used to break strikes in the mine.
Yeah, that's the one I'd pick.
The coal be on their that's where they got the name.
Yeah, so if everyone was on a strike for the coal mines, then if you saw a lad walking around town with coal in his legs, he's breaking the strike. But so now, similar to that, it was now very obvious if you saw a tram driving around, they're breaking the strike. So it was sort of free reign in the first week to attack any of the trams or buses you saw going around the place. So I think it was on the second day, the tram works where the trams that get fixed up after being attacked are down here in Inchicore, which means they would have to come past this Union Hall. And when they were coming past, so 2 of them had tried to come down Thomas Street, they'd gotten destroyed. A third one was eventually coming down, this time with police protection. And when it came past Emmet Hall, the local councillor Patrick O'Carroll was in the middle of giving a speech to the union workers out. I'm going to pick that window. Yeah, why not? One of these windows anyway. More than likely. So he's in the middle of giving an impassioned speech to the pro-union people outside when the Dublin Metropolitan Police, so it's a mix between the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabularies, and the Dublin Metropolitan Police, I guess would have been the main force here. So they're guarding the tram coming down. All the union workers are here. The tram's got to get down there so it can get fixed. And they all beat the shit out of each other. So all the union people run into the hall for protection, and the DNP comes in after them, kicks in the door, and at some point, I don't know what the extent of his injuries were, but someone knocks Patrick O'Carroll over the head with a baton. So eventually they have to get, so Richmond Barracks is the military barracks is right next door. So eventually they had to get them out to quell the riot, and that put an end to it. And they managed to get the trams down to the tramway, but the tram workers there refused to fix the trams being run by the scab workers. So I think in a statement the next day, Murphy said, "We build..." I don't know what he would sound like. What's the Monty Burns impression? "We build, repair and paint the tram cars at Inchicore, but we're unable to get our body makers to repair the damaged cars. This, of course, could not be tolerated, and a formal demand was made this morning on 2 of the men in succession. They both refused and were promptly dismissed. So things are heating up. So obviously, since Murphy owns half the papers in the country, after the riots, he sort of can dictate what happens in his papers. So they ran a story that included, each time the police drew back, the howling rabble followed them from all directions. The little barefoot urchin, boys and girls, more daring than their elders, dashed out every now and then, gathering up fresh ammo for the mob. Women with dishevelled hair and looking like maniacs were even more persistent than the men in belabouring the police.
Yeah. Rabble.
yeah.
Rabble is their favourite word in the Indo, and it's funny because it kind of reminds me of Edmund Burke writing about the French Revolution. He calls the French people the swinish multitude. You know, they've taken over Paris, and that's the kind of Indo line. But the problem they have during the lockout is that Larkin's paper is just selling like hotcakes.
Yeah.
I think it's selling 20,000 copies an issue, which for a Labour paper is extraordinary, the Irish Worker. And that's the highest circulation of any kind of radical. They reckon by comparison, the Sinn Féin paper was selling about 3,000 copies across the country. This is selling 20,000 copies on the streets of Dublin.
Yeah.
So there is an alternative news source, if you will, during the lockout, and people are reading it. And the reason the kids are selling it, the newsboys, they get a better commission to sell Larkin's paper than they do to sell the Indo. And they've just been on strike with the Indo, so they don't particularly like the Indo
And
anyway.
they also, I mean, you kind of know if you're working for Larkin's paper, it's selling a lot of issues. If you have any demands at all, you've kind of got them over a barrel there. You want a wage rise, you're getting a wage rise. It's, but I really, really love the use of little barefoot urchins. To purposely single out the women with dishevelled hair.
Yeah.
Down here at the riot, not looking
It was
burned.
the style at the time.
It was just those Inchicore maniacs. But so the first kind of week after the start of the strikes, there's a lot of tension. There's action happening all across the city between strikers and strike breakers. On Saturday the 30th of August, there's tensions down here again. People are throwing stones at the spa works just for the crack. Dublin Metropolitan Police are supposed to be coming in to keep the peace, but they're just on the side of the establishment and beating up the strike workers. So there's a big incident that I read an article about and then realised that you wrote the article. Which happens shockingly often.
Yeah,
when I'm
it'd
trying
be
to.
a good time in general just to say we've pilfered like a lot of stories.
Oh god. Yeah. Yeah, it's all research. Yeah, but
It's not when it's word for word.
Perfect. I just put a quotation marks behind everything. I'm like, I'm quoting Donal's article. But so one of the big incidents is on that Saturday near the end of August. There's a massive fight breaks out between the Shelburne football team and the Bows football team.
Yeah, Bose hadn't completed their metamorphosis into the Communist Party yet.
Yeah, but so I think it is
a question. What's the deal with Bose?
I mean, Bohemians football is actually kind of part of this story in a weird way. It begins in Belfast Association football because Belfast has a working class. It's the working class game. When it comes to Dublin, it's a bit more complex. Ringsend is, I suppose, it's traditionally a very working class area. So Shamrock Avenue gives us Shamrock Rovers. Shelburne come from Shelburne Drive, I think, or Shelburne Road. But Larkin in the football is deeply entangled in politics from the beginning. Bohemians are founded by members of the Royal Military School and Bell's Academy, which trains civil servants. So they're kind of the middle class team in Dublin at that time. Larkin's paper says that when Shelburne and Bows are playing each other, that there's a scab playing on each team.
Yeah, I'd read that he'd said on one of the teams. We didn't say which one.
But people have dug on this and dug on this. And one of the problems with Larkin's paper is because there's no editor, Larkin's the editor. You know, so Larkin can print whatever he wants. The paper is sued for libel, I think, 12 times in its first year of publication. Like Larkin accuses people of all kinds of things in that paper. Employers, things they hadn't even done in some cases. So Larkin just prints what he wants. And this creates a scene where there's a belief that there's a scab on each team. It doesn't seem there actually is in retrospect. One player, Jack Lowry, probably is, but the other player I'm not convinced by. And people arrive at the ground and there's just mayhem outside. But I suppose it's the end. The Irish Worker during this dispute, it's a rallying cry. And if the Irish Worker says do something, the people in Dublin are going to go out and do it. But it's ugly. It's an ugly confrontation outside the football ground. Not the first or last in League of Ireland history.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
It should be said.
Because a lot of the contemporary reports are like, it's a dark day to see hooliganism entangled in the great sport of football. We shall never see its like again. There's a crowd of about 6,000 people in outside Ringsend, and the police are called in, and there's a big... so 16 people are arrested, 50 hospitalised by it, which...
Yeah, I mean, the Dublin Metropolitan Police are out of control. One of the problems with the DMP as a police force is they're not a normal police force. They also run the intelligence police. G Division is the intelligence police service in Dublin. They're also part of the DMP. So it's not like, you know, the happy Bobby on the street corner. You know, the DMP is an inherently political police force. That's its job. And when you supplement it with RIC men who don't know Dublin at all and who are brought into the city, and one of the cartoons in Larkin's paper is a RIC man with a bottle of Jameson in hand. I mean, that's based on testimony of people who tell an inquiry, I saw a policeman drinking on the street.
Oh, yeah.
You've rural men who don't know Dublin, the DMP, who are a political police force at their core. It's a tinderbox, really, and it's not surprising. Most of the real violence in 1913 is police violence. There's a police riot in corporation buildings, which is the worst public housing in the city. Like in Monto, they build public housing in Monto.
Yeah.
Like it's cheap to build there, so just put the poor into a red light district, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
Those people don't work. That's an area with massive unemployment, and the DMP go in and just smash up the houses there. So I think it's not a coincidence that when the Rising happens, two of the first people shot on the streets of Dublin are members of the DMP, and they're both shot by the Citizen Army. Yeah. I think the memory of 1913 for the Citizen Army, when they get the chance to go after the DMP, they really take it.
Yeah. I don't like the singling out of countrymen being the only men drunk in the DMP. You're not wrong, but because even for the incident you're talking about, so that's good. That's the next bit in the story. But yeah, you read accounts where it's like drunken policemen did this stuff, and you're like, it's probably a bit colourful. But maybe that is exactly how it happened. It all happens on the 31st of August is the big first event in the strike. So Larkin is due to give a speech on Sackville Street, now O'Connell Street, but Dublin Castle has banned it for their fear of like inciting a riot. DMP are there in force, the RIC are there, and they're all looking out for him. But Big Jim sneaks into the Imperial Hotel on Sackville Street wearing a fake beard, and he'd drawn on wrinkles. So he'd snuck in there.
How old was he at this stage?
I was like 33, 4 at this stage, maybe. But he was like, but there's so many things from this time where it just seems like no one had tried it before, and it's like cartoonish. He was just huddled over, and he'd booked a hotel room the night before. So like he'd been banned from doing the speech, and then someone rang up and booked a hotel room for the next day under the name Donnelly, and then he hobbled in there with he had a woman with him, which I'd read in different accounts was Nellie Gifford. Yeah. Oh yeah, so Gifford or Gifford?
It's Gifford apparently.
Yeah. But then I don't know in different accounts it was just a woman. But so the kick is, so he goes into the hotel, and the rub is that the hotel is also owned by William Murphy. Just like everything else in the city, which is just the audacity to do it in the own man's house. Yeah.
But it's weird because there's a union meeting happening at the same time in Croydon Park, and they reckon most of the people. There's a picture of the DMP and the RIC just wading in on the crowd, and a good chunk of those people in that picture are just shoppers. They're just Sunday shoppers that happen to be on Sackville Street. So it's. I think that's people in Dublin really have a sense that the police are out of control when it's not just Larkin's rabble that are being attacked. People that are out shopping on Sackville Street are having their heads battened in.
Because this is what I was thinking. Because you're right. There's the meeting gets cancelled, so there's another meeting out in Fairview, and that's where most of the union people are, because that's where they're supposed to be. And Larkin is quoted as saying like, "I'll be on Sackville Street, alive or dead," or something to those words. But yeah, like he goes up, he sneaks up and goes out to a balcony and starts shouting out to people. And as it's remembered, it's always like, and he shouted out to thousands of union supporters there. But yeah, they must have just been citizens. Like no one, first of all, couldn't hear him, because he was like, megaphone right, and he was just up on a balcony shouting, and it would have just been people who were out shopping. But so he's quoted as saying, "Comrades and friends, the police have forbidden a meeting to take place on Sackville Street today, but I am here to speak and will remain till I am arrested," which he was arrested in about 2 minutes. But I had a note on Gifford. So Nellie Gifford was sisters of Grace and Muriel. I believe there's other Gifford sisters then as well. Grace would go on to marry Joseph Plunkett in Kilmainham Jail over the road, and at the time Muriel was married to Thomas McDonough. Muriel and Thomas had a son called Donagh McDonough. which is just, why would you do that?
Bullying hadn't been invented yet, see.
He brought the secondary education of Ireland.
Oh yeah, Donal McDonough, did great stuff for he probably tried to reform the schools after all the kids bullied him when he was a child. But I really not really liked, but so obviously Thomas McDonough were going to get executed during 1916, and Muriel died a year afterwards from apparent heart attack while swimming from Skerries to Lambay Island during a holiday for the 1916 Widows and Orphans, which sounds simultaneously like the coolest event in Dublin and also one you wouldn't want to be at. But so it was the first one. It was like it must have been the year after the executions, and then she tried to swim across the island. Apparently, had a heart attack along the way and died. A real downer on what would have been such a fun event. But there's a great photo then as well.
It's amazing.
Of,
I think it's Joe Cashman. I think he took it. But it's like if someone gets battened over the head and there isn't a photographer there to see it, did it really happen? You know, like it's the defining picture of the lockout. And he must be, he's either in a different room of the hotel or he's in Cleary's, but he's got this perfect view of it happening down below. And it's front page. Every British newspaper runs this. The police riot on O'Connell Street, front page. And Vladimir Lenin picks up on this. Like this becomes a big international story. And Lenin quotes the Indo, but he says, the Irish independent, and then in brackets he says, independent my eye. so the idea of Lenin laughing at the Indo is great, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of people in the British Labour movement who are a bit, we don't know about Larkin, he's kind of out of control, he acts of his own volition. But when that picture appears on the front of the Illustrated London News and the police are just out of control in Dublin, it really focuses the attention on the city. And
well, this is the photo there, yeah. It's crazy, yeah.
It's a work of art, that picture. Like,
it's insane. Yeah. You would wonder if he just tried to stage it and get everyone back the next day.
But when they were filming Strumpet City, the problem with that scene was...
Oh, I thought you were going to say they got it because they were filming Strumpet City.
The Larkin statue kept getting in the way. So even when Larkin was dead, he was still a pain sometimes.
Was there, what I was actually talking about, the other photo of Larkin being frog marched out of the hotel afterwards is you can see him with his fake beard and stuff after he's been kicked out by the DMP. But like it is. And there is a kind of thing about like
he's not very tall. He had another man underneath the trench coat.
So he
could hide his way in.
But you do kind of feel, so you'll notice now I gave myself the high stool when I knew the door was
I wanted to call that out earlier on. I thought it was...
That's a Trumpian power move.
Yeah.
Because he could have just put the laptop on the tallest thing and made it easy to read.
Nope.
But instead of that, he's gone for the furthest distance, most awkward angle.
Because this goes back to what we were talking about earlier on, when like Larkin comes into town, there is a sense of people just being like, he's so tall and handsome, and that does really feed into people listening to him, which whatever that bias would be called, but it exists back then as well. But this is the giant riot. That was what the photo was taken from. The DMP, instead of trying to like de-escalate the situation, just started hitting everyone. Two strikers, James Nolan and John Byrne, are like fatally wounded. They die later on that day. There was an MP there called Handel Booth who said, kicking victims when prostate was a settled part of police program that day. So after the initial riot on Sackville Street, this is what you were talking about earlier on, the tenement houses of the workers were attacked and ransacked by the police while drunk. Just went in and like already like these people lived in terrible conditions, and the police just went in and destroyed the place. So after the violence of the day, it was known as Bloody Sunday, which was the first in an illustrious career of Bloody Sundays of the 20th century. So 2 days later, on the 2nd of September, one of the tenement buildings at 66 Church Street collapsed and buried the 5 families that were living in there. Inside, 7 people died, including 3 children. So this is all happening against the backdrop of these workers, the people who live in these houses, striking for better conditions, and one of the houses just falls in. The story I'd seen in the documentary I was watching was that there was a theatre across the road, and they were showing a play, The Colleen Bawn, and the people inside thought that the house falling down was part of the play, so they didn't react. But the play is like a romance story. So I don't know at what point they thought that a building collapsing and people screaming was part of the story.
Production values have gone through the roof.
There it is. The story's a bit boring, but wow. But the only interesting bit I got out of that tale is that there's a character in there called Miles Ní Copleen, which is where I guess he got his name from. But this is kind of used, this is pointed as like why we need the strike or why they need an increase.
And the employers are kind of, the line they have is, oh, this is not connected. This is totally disparate. This has nothing to do with the strike. Mr. Murphy gives money to housing charities, and he thinks it's awful the houses are collapsing in Dublin. And then it turns out that actually one of the children who's killed in that collapse, Eugene Salmon, he'd been locked out of his job the day before. He worked in Jacobs. A day before his house falls down, he's told, you're out of work. Sorry.
Yeah.
So you can't separate these things. You know, the houses that people live in and where they work and their labour rights, these things are all connected. And Church Street happens at a time when the world's actually looking at Dublin. So if a tenement collapsed in Dublin 3 years before that, would anyone really care? Probably not. But everyone in the British press is putting two and two together and saying, this is quite bad.
Well, as you were saying, like, this is 2 days after that picture becomes front page news, and all of a sudden people are paying attention, and then a building collapses. But
what a week he's had, though. Loses his house and job.
Yeah, it's pretty miserable. Yeah, it just captures the awfulness of the city at the time.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
He must be the poster
I
child.
remember some saying, "Oh, Strumpet City, it couldn't have been that bad," and something, it was worse. You know?
Yeah,
There's a romanticism, at least, in that.
Sure. What was so Murphy and the Employers Federation response to this tragedy is to force the other employers of the Federation to lock out more members of the trade union. I think this is where it's introduced basically that the employers, if they want to come back to work, have to sign a document to say that they won't sign up to the ITGWU, which is a move that brings in the British trade unions then, because I think they've been sitting on the fence up until now, and this is seen as going against one of the core tenets of being part of a trade union. Employers can't force you to not go into one of the trade unions, so it brings them into action. They organise a giant march in Dublin the week after to show solidarity, and they start sending over food packages for the families of the people that are affected. I think by the end of September they're sending over £150,000 worth of supplies to the displaced workers, which by the end of that month is also about 20,000 men and women out of work. I'd also read that so a lot of the food parcels would have been handed out from this hall as one of the trade union administration places, and apparently they were also getting food supplies from Richmond Barracks, either by hook or by crook. I don't know. I'd heard stories of them being given them, it being sold to them, it disappearing off the back of shelves, but they were feeding them in some sense.
It sounds like a great moment. The leader of the British Labour Party, Kerr Hardy, he arrives in Dublin on this ship loaded down with supplies, and there's just thousands. Imagine the euphoria of that. It's kind of weird to me that Kerr Starmer is named after him.
Yeah.
Frankie Boyle described Kerr Starmer as having all the charisma of an unassembled IKEA bookshelf, which I think is actually being quite kind to Kerr Starmer. But Kerr Hardy, who knew Connolly had been involved in the British Labour movement with Kerr. The idea of this Scottish/British trade union Labour leader arriving, it's beautiful because there was so much stuff in the papers about Ireland and Britain that was very negative. You know, these wild savages who refuse home rule, who we cannot who. You know, the Fenian stuff, the Fenians are presented as ape-like characters, and yet the people of Salford, Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, they put their hands in their pockets and they send that working-class assistance across the Irish Sea. It's a beautiful moment.
The photos are very sad, aren't they, when you see the children on the docks waiting for the ship to come in.
Yeah.
It's powerful. Mazer, a couple of years ago, took one of those images, so I don't know if anyone remembers this, in the middle of town on the Sugar Club. He took one of the SS Herod images and he blew it up really big, and it's amazing to look at people, no shoes on their feet, tiny kids.
Yeah, it was a very impoverished time. But then on the 8th of September, so this is just a couple of, I guess, big moments that happened then after that, W.B. Yeats publishes Romance in Ireland, which was later retitled to September 1913, in which I think it's sort of retroactively been changed to be about the lockout, but at the time he was writing about the Hugh Lane Gallery debacle, which William Murphy was also leaning in heavy on. So the Hugh Lane Gallery is up near the top of O'Connell Street. I think I was trying to find the quote. I remember reading years ago that there was the big debate was basically you can't put a gallery on the north side. One, they won't know what to do with it over there. Two, if they figure out, we're fucked because they won't come to work anymore if they see art. But what William Murphy was arguing against, I think, is a compromise. But at some point, the idea came up that they were going to replace the Halfpenny Bridge with an art gallery. So they're going to take the bridge off and make the Hugh Lane Gallery go across the river, and there'll just be art in it. Which, in fairness to Murphy, that is a very stupid idea.
Which is why I was instantly like, great idea.
That sounds class. It's such a we can't put it on the north side, but if we have to, we'll put it over the river.
Half of it on the north side.
Yeah.
They wrote to Bernard Shaw and said, what do you think about this? And Bernard Shaw wrote back, an art gallery on a river sounds very romantic, but the River Liffey would take the romance out of anything.
Yeah. So in fairness to Yeats, the old dirty pervert, it's a pretty good poem. But so the witch, oh, he is a pervert. Yeah, we did an episode about him recently. Yeah, he's an odd man. But
Wait till you get to Joyce.
oh yeah. Oh, see, we did a comparative study at the end. Joyce, weird for the time, but modernly his proclivities would be accepted now. Yeats, accepted at the time, fucking weird now. But so on the 24th of, so at the end of September, the British government brought in the Asquith inquiry, where Sir George Asquith was asked to like hold meetings with employers, with employees, find out who had the legitimate grievance and try and sort it out for them, which the employers didn't like when Asquith sided with the employees, so they just decided to ignore it and moved on. There's a very good article then published by George W. Russell, who went by the alias AE, which is, does none of his initials. It's almost too much of an alias. But he wrote a thing on the 7th of October. So he's addressing the aristocracy of industry in this city. He said, "The conception of yourselves as together virtuous and wronged is, I assure you, not at all the one which onlookers hold for you." It ends with, "You may succeed in your policy and ensure your own damnation by your victory. The men whose manhood you have broken will loathe you, and will always be brooding and scheming to strike a fresh blow. The children will be thought to curse you. Humanity abhors, above all things, a vacuum in itself, and your class will be cut off from humanity as the surgeon cuts the cancer and alien growth from the body." So on the 10th then of October, Archbishop of Dublin comes back, Archbishop Walsh. He comes back for the continent and tries to immediately catch up with what's been going on for the last couple of months. So he also sides with the labour movement. He sides with Larkinism for about 10 minutes until the British Trade Union come up with the Kiddies scheme, or the Dublin Kiddies scheme, which, yes, I think this is what you were alluding to earlier on. And this is, so the Catholic Church initially are kind of on side with it. They see that the employees have a legitimate grievance. But the trade union, the British Trade Union, come up with an idea, because the strike's been going on for 2.5 months at this point. Yeah, people are starving in the street. You see the pictures of the children, they've got no shoes on. The British Trade Union come up with an idea where, which is similar, I guess, to what happened in World War I and World War II. Send your kids to us. We'll send them out the country. We'll have, rich families look after them. Trade union families, we'll feed them until this all settles down. Yeah. And Murphy pumps it out into his newspapers that this is just an elaborate scheme by Larkin and Connolly, who are half British, lest we forget, to steal our children and convert them to Protestantism. And so the whole idea was like the image going down and blocking them at the docks from sending their children off. And they're like, it's better to die here and starve a Catholic than to go over there and become a Protestant.
And like the nationalist, some of the nationalist newspapers, like Arthur Griffith and people like that, they think this is wrong. They think this is embarrassing. Like you're waging cultural war on the British, and you're going to put your hand out and ask the British for assistance. So some of the nationalist voices in Dublin are rallying against this as well, and they think that these kids could turn into little English liberals or something. But they've done it in Belgium. They had a general strike in Belgium in 1913, and they sent the children to the families of workers in, I think, France. And it's a good idea. Removes kids from a battlefield, which is what Dublin had become by that point. But it's weird that the church were so against it, because they kind of liked Larkin on one level. Larkin can quote the Bible like that, you know, and his political rhetoric is really, he talks about the divine mission of discontent. He tells them the day that they batten those people, you won't crucify Christ in Dublin anymore. Like, he really talks a religious speak, and I think that he's not really interested in theoretical lefty stuff like Connolly is. He talks this. It's a fusion of like socialism and Christianity. And I think the church are kind of half interested in Larkin for a while. But this idea of these kids going to England is just too much for them. And they pull children off trains, which is amazing. In Westland Row, they literally, the ancient order of Hibernians, or the ancient order of hooligans, as Francis G. Skeffington calls them, they pull women and children off trains at Westland Row. It's just meant.
Which is pointless, because there's no train to England anyway. Just let them off. But so Larkin's released from prison on the 13th of November. He, I think, been sentenced at some point in October for the inciting a riot. As soon as he gets out, he heads off to England to sort of rally support. But because of the violence against the strikers, himself, James Connolly, and a man called Jack White formed the Workers' Militia designed to protect striking demonstrators, and they called it the Irish Citizens Army. And they also set up a branch in Emmet Hall. So yeah, that was to train the Inchicore Crumlin faction of the army. And a man called Michael Mallin was appointed second in command and chief training officer of the new ICA at the time. So Mallin was born in the Liberties. He was a former British soldier and a silk weaver. In 1930, he was secretary of the Socialist Party of Ireland and had led a strike of silk workers against the Hanbury Lane factory, which I'm actually not sure if that happened before the other strikes or that was part of the general strikes. But he was commended for like his strike negotiating skills.
People always say, "Oh, he was in the British Army. He must have been very good at organising this workers' militia." He was a drummer in the British Army. So, yeah. They did have a marching band in the Citizen Army, so to fit them all up, I found. So
that was his main. So in December 1913, Larkin and Connolly kind of make a last-ditch effort to get the Trade Union of Britain to go on a sympathetic strike with them. So this is their big play. The strike's been going on for months now at this stage, but if they can get a sympathetic strike from all the unions in Britain, that'll really bring the employers to the table. But they refuse, and then over a long cold winter in Dublin, I mean, it's cold in here now, and it's March, so imagine being in tenements with no money and winter coming around. So workers start slowly going back to work. They sign the pledge not to join the ITGW. And on the 18th of January 1914, Larkin advises the remaining strikers to return to work and basically give up on the strike. But at this stage, a lot of them have been replaced in their old jobs and have been locked out effectively forever. So the trade union takes a massive hit with this defeat. Larkin moves on to America, and a lot of the workers who've been blacklisted in general go and join the British Army out of necessity, and a couple of months later find themselves in Belgium for World War I, which a guy was telling me is something very similar happened in the north, where there's kind of an open secret in the north that the British Army was one of the big employers of Catholics. So a lot of people, it was the only thing you could do when you couldn't get a job in the shipbuilding or textile industry. So when the Troubles came around, the British were like, how are these boys so well trained? They seem to know all of our moves. So Home Rule gets postponed then because of World War I, which we've talked about before. Must have been extremely suspicious for anyone who was waiting for that to happen. It was due to come in September, and then all of a sudden someone gets shot, and then...
Singer of a band called Franz Ferdinand.
Yeah, the lead singer of Franz Ferdinand gets shot. I thought Take Me Out was a bit of a banger, but... Well, like it must have been...
Take Me Out a bit literal.
Yeah. But it must have been shocking to me, like, because they were fucking slowly edging towards this, like, Home Rule for years. Like, decades have been going on, and all of a sudden something happens, and though it's shelved, and, like, the whole world has gone to war. But, so, yeah, the strike is broken. It's seen as something of a Pyrrhic victory for Murphy. The employers had technically won, but a strike like that was never attempted again, or to, like, be so harsh against strikers. It had really damaged the people of Dublin. But in October of 1914, Michael Mallin was appointed Chief of Staff of the ICA. In May of 1915, he moved in to live in an apartment above the Emmet Hall with his wife and 5 young kids. So, was it just the 4? Oh, where did he get the 5th one from?
Well, they had a dog, so that
one that wasn't allowed around the country.
Aha. So this would be this space? Or, because
you can see the wallpaper, so there's some contention. Did Emmet Hall go this way, or did it go that way? I'm not quite sure. Did they live over there, or did they live in this group?
Sure.
I'm going to say here for the natural light.
Yeah.
I've been at home for a while now. I've been watching a lot of like Grand Designs and stuff with me, man.
Yeah.
The man was a wallpaper hanger as well.
He had a great sense of design. So, yeah, like then James Connolly and the ICA helped smuggling guns during the Host gun running.
The elephant not in the room is Jim Larkin, who's gone.
Oh yeah.
So
he
like Larkin's in America, and that leaves the Union and the Army in the hands of Connolly, who's much more nationalist in his politics than Larkin.
Yeah.
I think when the First World War is kind of on the horizon, a lot of the labour movement around Europe, the trade unions had convinced themselves this won't happen. Workers of the world unite. If they turn the cannons on the workers, we'll turn them back on the bosses. But actually, overnight, what happens is the labour movement all over Europe just collapses. The suffragettes in England stop campaigning for the right to vote. And they say, oh, we'll help win the war, and when the war's over, you'll give us the right to vote. So the left is in crisis all over the continent. And I think Connolly kind of loses some of that faith in socialism, or socialist revolution anyway, and begins to think that the best thing you can do is align yourself with other people who are demanding self-determination. So the citizen army and the volunteers end up very, very close now. And, I don't know if that would happen in the exact same way if Larkin was still here, but Connolly is kind of taking the red and the green, and it's becoming much closer.
It might have happened more on. There might be more closeness here in Inchicore because they both use the same hall.
Yes.
Places where they would have been separated. And when Ling was reading researching this, Connolly was slagging the Sinn Féin paper all the time because they were called what did they call them? From the Falls. They were called because the Sinn Féin and IRB were all the same. From the Falls, way. Whereas Connolly had his, what was he doing? He was out every weekend.
That's why they kidnapped him in the end too.
They had to kidnap him.
They had to kidnap him. Yeah.
But commenting on Larkin, it's a big sorrow for me that he went off to America.
About 20 years.
Well,
He came back and what?
And when he came back, he had a row with the union, but he wasn't here what's his name?
William Partridge.
Partridge,
yes.
Partridge was very
He has to be.
Well, Partridge was another,
And he was here.
He was here as
And
well.
Partridge was here before Connolly
Yes.
or Larkin. He organised a strike up in CIE before Larkin or Connolly appeared on.
And he handed over, because I don't know, did he live here before Mallin? But he used to
No,
He was put in charge of this hall.
I
Yes.
don't think he didn't live here. He never lived here.
Yes.
But he ran the hall. He ran.
Yeah, and he William Partridge is this kind of powerhouse of kind of the local labour movement, and the lads are involved in there's a great plaque for him over the door. But he is imprisoned after the Rising, and he dies as a result of imprisonment. So you're losing all these big people. And when you've just had an armed insurrection, there's also a lot of people who say, well, I've done my bit now. A lot of people walk away from politics. And there's kind of burnout, as you would expect. You've just been in a burning post office. You've the right to say, I'm done for a while.
I've seen enough now,
So the labour movement is, after the Rising, the very confident people who lead from the front, something like Partridge, Larkin, a lot of them are gone. And you end up with more moderate people taking over the labour movement who are like, oh, I'm not so sure about this. William O'Brien and Tom Johnson, they don't want to be as involved in the talk of revolution. They're quite happy to rein it in a little bit. So it's a great tragedy of the age, really. The best of them are dead or gone.
Well, we finish up on the revolution then. So 1916 Rising, Michael Mallin goes in along with Markovich and Rosie Hackett, who was also involved heavily with the ICA and the trade union stuff, who is the last bridge to be named after someone? Yeah. So they went in, had their part in the Rising, they took over Stephen's Green and the College of Surgeons, as it's called. And maybe Murphy's Revenge after 1916, Murphy's newspapers calls for the men to be assassinated, including his old rivals in the strike, Connolly and Mallin. So he does kind of turn on his nationalistic views there. But Con Colbert, one of the other men executed in 1916, was also associated with the Hall. And I only realised the other day that the road out to the bypass is named after Con Colbert. They trained troops here for the Rising. It was an integral part of the plans then. They were all involved with this place. And so I think the last, you may be able to correct me on this, but this has been empty since 1984. It was fairly out of use since the 20s.
Yeah, there was a bookies in one of the shops below until fairly recently.
The things Larkin hated were booze and gambling.
To Larkin.
Makes me laugh. But the things Larkin loved, Larkinism was, I think it was as much as anything, it was about counterculture. And if you went to Liberty Hall when Larkin was there, and probably Emmet Hall too, you know, in Liberty Hall they had a theatre, and they had a creche. Women couldn't get involved in the union because women have two jobs. They work a job and then they raise a family. So you have a creche so women could get involved. They had their own printing press. They had a football team, they had a boxing team. They had a workers' co-op. Everything was there. And I think Larkinism was about putting joy into people's lives and putting culture as well as politics into people's lives. And to see Emmet Hall back in use for events is great. That's what he
I
would
don't want to end on this note, so maybe you can say something sentimental after this. But because when you're talking about this, because there used to be a cinema run out of here, and I read an account of someone a young lad who went to see a film here in 1919 called Birth of a Nation. Did you read that? An extremely racist film from the Americans.
He's not here, is he?
Yeah, and for the next screening of Birth of a Nation. But no, I was saying to Lauren earlier on, like I was getting sentimental research in this stuff. Like in the 20s, it wasn't just used for Revolution, it was also used as a community hall. There was Cayleys here, there was bands, it was where people came to meet and gather, and also former Revolution. But yeah, it's great to see it open again, and a round of applause for the D8 development team and Lauren. And that's it. So if anyone has any questions, fire away. If not, we can all go to the pub.
Say Liam
Oh yeah.
and Michael have written a lot of stuff on the local history of this area, and I think buildings like this are very forgotten until it's always local historians across the city, and every area of Dublin has those historians. They're the ones who say that happened there, and up and down this street, from connections to poets like the great Michael Hartnett to the barracks, the mill, all that stuff is highlighted because of people like those local historians. So yeah, in part, the plaques outside this building were put up by the groups they're involved in, so they're a big part of the story of this place too, and reminding people it's here.
Yeah, fair play to you. Yeah, well, it was during lockdown. It was just me walking around the street looking up for the first time because I had nothing else to do for 2 years. I was reading the plaques here, and then the one to Michael Hartnett across the road.
I admire you being able to read, because
Well, I had to Google them afterwards. This one's up very high.
last of mine, I went to around with the hairdresser over there. She said that the place was no use, Inchicore was no use, it was just a dump, and the heritage group never do anything. And I said, well, I would do something. I said, actually, you need to be a giraffe.
Well, hopefully we'll start campaigning for lower plaques now. But oh yeah, we've got one question.
So, I could be totally off here, but did I read before that when he came back from the States, there was kind of the money was just resting in my account?
You did read that because Kevin Myers wrote a series of articles on Larkin when he was in the Irishman's Diary. Don't know what happened in the end there, but Myers wrote about that. Larkin comes back. He's in Sing Sing prison. The problem he has, J. Edgar Hoover, the man who founds the FBI, zooms in on Larkin when he arrives in America, calls him the most dangerous man in America, which is extraordinary because he's literally just off the boat, and they lock him up for criminal anarchy. And in the time that Larkin is in jail, back home in Ireland, the Union is in new hands. William O'Brien, Thomas, they're much more conservative in their approach. They don't really want to get involved in Larkinism, you might say. And when Larkin comes home, he's basically totally sidelined. And there's this great picture of Larkin, the one that inspires the statue. And there's all these adoring people around looking. But there's another version of that picture that's taken a little further back. And actually, there's very few people around. Everyone that's around him is in that picture. It's like 6 people, Larkin. But he comes back and he's kind of a beaten docket in some ways. The union's in new hands. He founds his own union, but Workers' Union of Ireland finds it hard to get it moving in any big way, clashes with the old union a lot. So rather than, I think, being some kind of philanderer who's living off the pockets of the union, Larkin's actually a very defeated figure by that time. And when he dies, his biographer, Emmet O'Connor, wrote that when he dies, he's very little money. He's 2 or 3 weeks' wages in the bank account when he dies. I think Larkin really, he's a moralist. His religion is Christianity, but socialism to him is a branch of it. And he loses elections, which a big Jim losing elections is mad. It's a sad thought actually that someone who evokes such strong feeling. I mean, we heard Plunkett talking about him coming down to Dublin like God, could end his life. It's quite marginalised politically. It's very sad.
We were having a good time listening to the kids being killed and such. That was a bit of a downer. But
just how rich was William Larkin Murphy? He sounds like a sort of Rupert Murdoch thing.
But he did seem to.
Good question.
Yeah, not entirely. It didn't see how much his wealth would have been, but he did own. He owned Cleary's, the Clock, and this shopping centre complex on O'Connell Street. He owns the Imperial Hotel. He owned the tramworks and the thing that fixed the tramworks. And as we were saying, international business.
Big shares in railways in South Africa as well. He's very interested in the emerging colonial world. But you have to ask, was he just a big fish in a small pond? Compare him to, say, Harland and Wolff in Belfast.
Yeah.
It's easy to be the biggest capitalist in a city of no industry.
That's what I was thinking from leading source history. Then when you mentioned all his international business, I thought it sounded like a bit of a...
Mr. Monopoly.
Yeah.
But then, like, I worked for a company, like an international financial company, and they could have went and based themselves in London with all the financial people, or went to New York, but he stayed in Uri and stayed there. And you're a big fish in a small pond, but it's fucking cool to be a big fish in a small pond. It's better than going over to London and just being some other guy. Like so maybe there's an element. And he has these nationalistic ideals, and he does seem to care about home rule, at least up until that point. But I'd say he was probably one of the richest men in Dublin anyway. But yeah, there's a picture of him here as a vulture, if you want to look at that. Somewhere. Is there any other questions?
Jesus. Sorry, that was my first time seeing that photo.
Yeah.
Cartoons, like there was left-wing cartoons, the Irish Worker, the Indo had their own cartoonist, and then there was a magazine called The Leprechaun.
Yes.
And that was like the Charlie Hebdo of Dublin politics in the early 20th century. It was an equal opportunities offender. So they ripped it out of Larkin, they ripped it out of William Martin Murphy, they ripped it out of everyone. But they did some,
The Leprechaun.
They did some good cartoons during the dispute. A lot of them are by Thomas Fitzpatrick, who's Jim Fitzpatrick, Tin Lizzy, Che Guevara, Jim Fitzpatrick, his grandfather.
Oh,
which is kind of mad.
Interesting, yeah. My favorite of all those was like the picture of the ape leaning over the table, signed Mr. G.O. Rilla. It was a great time for any man who could draw a monkey. It was great business. But well, yeah, that's it. I think thanks very much for coming out. If anyone's interested, we're going to the pub across the road, and
not the Horse and Jockey.
Not the Horse and Jockey. It's closed down. Yeah. But yeah, that's the end of the show. Thank you.